My name is Denise Egan-Stack, and I'm president of OCD Massachusetts, and this is the Les Brodberg Memorial Lecture Series. So, on to tonight's lecture. Dr. Kristen Mulcahy is a licensed clinical psychologist who's been in practice on the Cape for the past 12 years, specializing in OCD and OCD spectrum disorders. She recently launched a mobile app called Live OCD Free, which guides OCD sufferers through ERP. You may have seen her recently on Chronicle with Mike Jenke. Several OCD treatment centers around the country are actually doing research on that app right now. Also, Dr. Mulcahy and I will be opening up an OCD clinic on the Cape in January of 2013 called Cape Nilands Cognitive Behavioral Institute. So please join me in welcoming her here tonight.
Well, thank you, and thank you guys all for coming out tonight. I know it's kind of a rainy, yucky night, but I'm really excited to talk to you guys about exposure and response prevention. And that's really because of my years in practice, I've seen how effective this treatment can really be and what a dramatic difference it can make in people's lives. And now, don't just take my word for it. There actually is decades worth of research that really supports this as an effective treatment for OCD. And so, really, it's the treatment of choice for OCD, and should really always be the foundation or basis for any OCD treatment plan. Now, some of you might be very familiar with ERP, maybe a little too familiar. And some of you may not have much information about it at all, and that's okay because we're really going to start off talking about the basics of what OCD is, how it works, how it comes about, how it's maintained, things that make it worse, and then very specifically how the ERP really diminishes symptoms of OCD. And then I'm going to try to give you guys some tips and things that I really consider to be really important things to keep in mind as you're doing ERP to really be as successful as possible. And then, lastly, I'm going to walk you guys through the app that I recently launched called Live OCD Free, which essentially guides OCD sufferers through exposure and response prevention. And hopefully I'll try to talk as fast as I can, as I know Denise's prompt, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time where you guys can even demo the app firsthand, and have some mobile devices that you can actually play with it on. Okay, and I apologize, I have a little bit of a head cold, and so I have my cough drops and water here just in case I have a coughing attack. Although if anybody has germ fear and wants some good exposure, come up front. Just kidding. Okay, so let's get started. So before we can even really talk about what ERP is, we really need to talk about what OCD is and really have a very clear understanding of that. So what is OCD? As I'm sure you probably all know, it's an anxiety disorder, and as the name implies, it's characterized by both obsessions and compulsions. An obsession is a repetitive thought or image or even just a feeling that causes significant anxiety, and it's something that you have a lot of trouble getting rid of. And a compulsion is anything that you do. It could be something that you do physically, like washing your hands, or it could be something that you do mentally, like reviewing in your head or counting. But the goal of it is to reduce the anxiety. And so the obsession increases anxiety, and the goal of the compulsion is to reduce it. And short-term compulsions tend to work quite well, which is why you engage in them. However, that's the key word, short-term. Long-term, they don't work so well, and they really tend to drive the OCD and make it much worse. So, say for example, you have contamination fears, and you touch something, it feels dirty, germy, maybe you have a thought that, oh, maybe I just contracted an illness from touching, that particular thing. What's the logical thing to do? Wash your hands, right, exactly, and it kind of makes sense. boom, you do it, you feel better, great, what's the problem? Well, the problem is really long-term. What tends to happen is as you engage in compulsion, they really tend to grow. And so maybe what was like a 20 or 30 second wash is now maybe taking 5 or 10 minutes, or maybe now it's multiple washes, or maybe you're doing like a surgical wash with the arms, or maybe now you have to take a whole shower because you just don't feel clean enough from from the hand washing alone. So that's really how compulsions can really kind of get out of control. And now what also tends to happen as you give in to compulsions is the obsessions will tend to grow and they'll generalize. And so more and more things come to trigger your anxiety. And sometimes those things are really kind of indirectly related to what even initially caused your anxiety. So maybe now it's not just coming into direct contact with something, maybe now it's just walking by something that seems suspicious, or driving by something, maybe coming into contact with something that came into contact with something that came into contact with something else that maybe possibly was contaminated. So more and more and more things come to really trigger the anxiety. So although compulsions, might seem like kind of reasonable strategies, long term they really backfire. So that's kind of the bad news, that we know what doesn't work. But the good news is that we know exactly what does work, and that's essentially the ERP. So let's talk about that a little bit. So exposure and response prevention, like I said before, is the only evidence-based treatment for OCD, and is definitely what you want to be kind of the core foundation of your treatment. We'll kind of break it down. The exposure is simply the process of gradually exposing yourself to whatever it is that triggers your anxiety. So it could be different situations, it could be specific thoughts, it could be images, whatever. It's purposely putting yourself in those situations where you're going to increase your anxiety. Sounds great, right? It gets better. The response prevention now means you actively resist giving in to any type of compulsive behavior. And so what a lot of people are, most afraid of is that, if I provoke my anxiety and I start obsessing, then I'll just be anxious forever and ever and ever. And the way I tend to explain it is that although I can't give you certainty about anything, obviously, right? Just like there's kind of laws of physics, there's really like laws of anxiety, and we can really very reliably predict how the anxiety is going to respond to the exposure. So as you do the repeated exposure, what's going to happen is first you're going to start to notice that, it's just not feeling, quite as intense as in, practicing over and over and over again. And then what you're going to start to notice is it's just not lasting quite as long. And then finally, what happens, and this is the best part, when you're really just not even getting the thoughts near as frequently as you were, and possibly not even at all. And those are both, really good scenarios to be in. I think even sometimes, periodically, everybody wants to, I just don't want to be plagued by these thoughts anymore. But I think sometimes it's good when you do periodically have a thought to kind of give you some practice, and when you know, okay, I'm really solid with this, and I really can, I really do know how to handle it should a situation come up. Basically, a lot of times you'll hear kind of statistics about how effective ERP is. Like it's effective for 70 or 80% of OCD sufferers. The way I look at it is if you implement the program, the ERP, effectively, if it's done in the right way, and you engage in it, it really should always work. Just like those laws that we were talking about, there's really no reason that it won't work. But if either of those two things are amiss, then potentially there's going to be a problem. So what we're going to kind of talk about next are what are some things to kind of keep in mind as you're going through ERP to really be as successful with it as possible, and what are some of the pitfalls that can happen. So first tip is to clearly delineate between what your obsession is and what your compulsions are. And sometimes this is a little bit easier said than done. Sometimes with certain symptoms like contamination fears, it's really, kind of clear cut that you're doing, a lot of very physical things, both in terms of, compulsions and in terms of the exposure you're doing, the kind of, realistically, touching things, and it's very physical and tangible, and it's easy to figure out. Sometimes, though, with certain symptoms, we can't always do what's called in vitro exposure, where you are kind of doing those more tangible type things. Certain symptoms, what we need to do, and an example of this is, say you have a fear that you're maybe going to run someone over with your car. Well, you can't practice that realistically, right? That would be really bad. But what you can do, and sometimes even though you could, kind of put yourself maybe in situations that you've been avoiding, like, driving in, more populated areas or at night, but it's still not always so easy to kind of provoke that obsession. They kind of come up, more spontaneously. So what we really need to do in those situations is do what we call in vivo exposure, where you're exposing yourself to the thoughts directly. And one way that we do this is through what's called loop tape exposures, where you will create a recording of different anxiety-provoking phrases or elaborate stories about your worst fear coming true, and that's kind of how you do the exposure for those type symptoms. So when you can't, kind of actively do it, you have to do it, really through your imagination, and essentially you will habituate, you'll, in the same way, you'll habituate to the anxiety, and it'll diminish in the same way as it would as if you were, touching different things and exposing yourself that way over and over again. So, but I think it's really important to kind of, sometimes that's something that people struggle with, how exactly do I expose myself to this, particular obsession. What also can happen is sometimes compulsions can be really very subtle, and this happens a lot with intrusive thoughts like harming obsessions or sexual obsessions, where a lot of times you'll have a thought and that's followed up with a whole lot of mental reviewing, in your head. Okay, what did that thought mean? How was I feeling? Why was I feeling that way? What does it mean? What, am I a terrible person? That is compulsive, that mental reviewing. But a lot of times that's something that people don't catch. And so you could be doing, really great exposure, you come up with a great loop tape exposure, you listen to it, but if you're following it with that mental reviewing, then essentially you're not going to make any progress. It's kind of like, touching a toilet and then going and washing your hands right away. It's really not accomplishing much of anything. So it's really important to kind of, really be very clear on what your compulsion is. And again, go back to the original definition that a compulsion is what you're doing, is anything that you're doing to try to get rid of your anxiety. So even though mental reviewing could kind of seem more like an obsession, it's actually compulsive, because the goal of it, the intention of it, is to really decrease your anxiety. So, but if you have those kind of, mixed up, then your whole treatment program could, really be very ineffective. So the next one, tackle exposures gradually. I think there's, sometimes a misconception about this therapy. I've heard people say things like, oh, I'm not going to go to, one of those therapists because she's going to, make me stick my head in the toilet. and that's actually a very, very different technique called flooding, where essentially you face all of your fears all at once. And it's not to say that that can be effective, but good luck getting somebody to actually do it. So by nature, the ERP is a gradual process. And the way that we do that is by creating an exposure hierarchy. So essentially, you're going to come up with all of the different exposures that you could possibly do, and then you're going to rate your anxiety associated with them. And then we always start with the least anxiety-provoking ones first. So this way it allows you to kind of build up confidence. It allows you, to really kind of, work your way through things in a gradual manner. And everybody has a different pace. Some people can kind of move through things a little bit more quickly. Some people it takes a little bit more time. One thing to kind of keep in mind is, although you don't want to overwhelm yourself, you don't want to move at a snail's pace either, because that's really a quick way of losing all motivation. So you really, have to be kind of aggressive enough in it so that you really see results. And I think sometimes people also kind of struggle with, okay, how do I, everything seems, anxiety-provoking, intensely anxiety-provoking, and how do I kind of, break that down and make it more manageable? And, that's part that I kind of love about doing therapy is, you get to be really creative, and I can always find a way to break it down and make it easier. And sometimes, a little bit of trickery can kind of go a long way. And I don't mean that doesn't sound very good. Not like trickery like in a deceptive sense, like this is a collaborative effort and we all agree what we're going to do. But it's kind of a good strategy of negotiating with yourself. Okay, how can I kind of come up with something that seems a little bit more manageable, but then I can kind of trick myself into thinking it's close enough to the other thing that I can actually get there. And so I'll give you guys kind of a quick example. I was working with an 11-year-old with an intense fear of throwing up, and he had trouble sharing food with other people for obvious reasons. And so what we did was we came up with a community food and drink game. And as you imagine, we would all pass food and drinks around. And, he did really well for the most part up until we got to the point where we were sharing drinks through a straw. So we pass it all around, it gets to him, he's like, yeah, no way, no thank you. So I said, okay, well, how about if you just drink from the glass? You've done that before, so just drink it. So he's a little bit concerned about the backwash from the straw, but, he could manage it. And like, okay, when you take a sip, I guess it's a little backwash anyway. So he did that. And I said, okay, well, how about now if you just touch your lips really, as lightly as you can to the end of the straw? He was still like, yeah, no. I said, okay, how about if you touch your finger to the straw and then touch your lips? That he was okay with. And now he was a smart kid. He's like, I see where you're going with this. He's like, all right, well now, essentially the contamination's on my lips already, so I might as well just touch the straw, and then, okay, I put it all together, I drank from the cup, and then I touched the straw, so I might as well just drink from the straw. I said, exactly. And so sometimes a little bit of trickery like that can really help kind of that negotiation process with yourself. And there's always, always a way to kind of break things down into more, manageable steps. So, okay, so the next one is always being willing to go wherever the OCD tries to take you. And this is a really important one, particularly as it relates to intrusive thoughts, because what inevitably happens as you're doing exposure to intrusive thoughts, and a lot of times you're doing things like loop tape exposures, what will happen is you will habituate, as you're doing the exposure over and over again, but then inevitably the thought morphs, right? And it throws like something else at you. And you're like, whoa, I wasn't ready for that one, and that one seems a whole lot worse. And it's really, really important that no matter what the OCD potentially throws at you, you want to make sure you handle it in exactly the same way. So it would be like, okay, all right, it threw that one at me, you figure it out, that's your obsession, that's what you need to do the exposure to. And, I kind of, credit, my ability to kind of, do that in a really just kind of practical, matter-of-fact way to my training, because we were taught, like, it doesn't, there's no boundaries. It doesn't matter what the OCD, what the obsession is, you do the exposure. And so I'll tell you guys kind of a funny story. Those of you who are in my support group, I may have told you this, I probably have, but it's a cute story. So this was when I was working in New York, and I was working with a man from the Dominican Republic intensively, and he had a lot of religious obsession. So I saw him 3 days a week, and another therapist was working with him 3 days a week. And this actually happened with another therapist, but honestly, had it been me, I would have done exactly the same thing. So he had a lot of trouble whenever he was in a church or passed by a church. He would do different compulsions. So for one of the sessions, they meet in front of a church, and he says to her, I have trouble touching my cross. Only he has a really thick Spanish accent, so she thinks he says crotch. And without missing a beat, she says, okay, well, you know what you gotta do. Go ahead, touch it. So he's fiddling with his cross. She's like, no, really, you don't have to be embarrassed. It's okay, I've done this before, just touch it. And finally, they figured out what was going on, and he comes into my office the next day and he's like, you guys are crazy. Like, you don't have any limits. It doesn't matter what it is. I'm like, no, it doesn't. Wherever the OCD takes you, you have to be willing to go. And if you are, and you just kind of approach it in the same matter-of-fact, practical kind of way, you can really get through it really, pretty easily. I don't want to say easily, but, in a manageable way. Okay, so the next one is, well, you know what, let me just back up, because I think, that kind of brings up another issue, which I think sometimes people have a question about, is how far do I carry my exposures and how extreme do I get? And, I think everybody approaches this a little bit differently, but, personally, I kind of like to look at things a little bit more functionally, like to really focus on, okay, what are the things that you're gonna, that are gonna come up in your daily routine? And so, are you likely to ever have to lick the bottom of your shoe? Unless you're at, like, a college frat party, probably not, but will you need to, potentially tie your own shoe, tie your kids' shoes, and maybe come in contact with the bottom of shoes, quite a bit, and really want to be able to do that without having any anxiety, or go, pop a potato chip in your mouth and not think about that. So I try to kind of focus on those more functional things. It's not to say that kind of going like a few steps beyond can't be really beneficial as well, because a lot of times what happens is, you kind of go like a couple extra steps to do, things that wouldn't normally come up and are a little bit more extreme. It really helps to make those other things that do come up, really seem a whole lot easier. So, and sometimes I've had people that they actually want to do, really like, they come up with, okay, this is like my ultimate exposure. I'm like in a dumpster. I'm like, okay, if you really want to, and then make me do it with them, of course. But I think, really just making sure you're really, at least tackling the things that you're going to need to really function optimally. That's really the most important. Okay, so next one is to be as consistent as possible with the ERP. And this is, probably the single most important thing, because the bottom line is if you're not consistent and you're not doing the exposure, the ERP on a regular basis, you're not going to get results. You have to do it consistently. And, this was actually, a huge motivator for me in terms of creating the app, because, there's nothing that I hate more than, when I'm working with someone and I've given them, all the education about, what they need to do, why we're doing it. We've, come up with a really good exposure hierarchy. They've agreed, okay, I'm going to go home and I'm going to do this, and they come back and they've done nothing. And because I know they're not going to get results if they do that. So, me being, a little bit on the controlling side, I actually, went to the trouble of creating a whole app to make it, really, easy to be consistent with your program, and to really, almost have like a surrogate therapist there with you. So that was kind of, a big motivation, as well as, obviously there's a lot of people, out there that don't have access to treatment with a specialist or with a professional. And so I also wanted to create, something that would be a really, good interactive self-help tool for those people as well. Okay, so moving on, we're going to talk about the app a little bit. I'll kind of, take you through a little demo of this, kind of, highlight all the different features of it, and then hopefully, I feel like I'm talking really fast. Denise, I know she's on a time schedule, but, stop me at any time if I'm talking too fast and you have questions. It's fine. I think we have enough time, but I'll take you guys through this. Okay, so this is actually the screen that you would come into. This is your main menu, and now there is both an adult and a kids version. So we're going to go through the adult version first, and then we'll kind of take a look at the kids version. The really nice thing is once you get your program set up, you can flip-flop back and forth. And the kids version is actually really cool. You get to fight the worry wizard. So a lot of the adults that I work with, actually like to practice in the kids version. It's a lot more interesting, but they work seamlessly together. So once you get all of your data, inputted in one version, it'll just pop up in the other one. So you can work with whatever, whichever one you choose. So, okay, so if you are working with the app as a self-help tool, there is, or not, just to get some good information, there is a 30-page user's guide housed within the app, which gives a lot of the information that I'm talking to you guys about tonight, about, kind of the psychoeducation about OCD, how the ERP works, how you would expose yourself with, different types of symptoms. There's tips for parents, so it really, is a fairly, comprehensive guide that will help you get your program set up if you are utilizing it on your own. And so, if you are in the app for the first time and you want to go set up your hierarchy, you're going to tap on Practice ERP, and this will bring you to your exposure hierarchy. Now, of course, things are entered in there already. If you were going in for the first time, nothing would be entered yet. So I'll show you how, if you tap Add Direct Exposure, that will take you to a screen where you'll input all of your information. So you would name the exposure so you can identify it in the exposure hierarchy. You'd write down what exactly it is you need to practice, so whatever the exposure is you're going to do, without giving into whatever compulsion. You can input specific compulsions, leave it general, and just say without giving into any compulsions. And then, of course, you would rate your anxiety. And the adult version of the scale is 0 to 100. The kids version is 0 to 10 to make it a little bit easier. And one tip about rating your anxiety, what I always have people do is kind of come up with what their 100 would be. What's the worst thing that they can imagine doing, and then I kind of use that as a benchmark. Because I find, especially with kind of more severe OCD, is that everything becomes like 80s and 90s and hundreds, and then we start going off the scale, like, oh, that's 120. And so we want to stay on the scale. So sometimes it's good to really kind of establish, a benchmark to rate everything else against. Okay, so once your exposure hierarchy is set up, what the app will do is it will put it in numerical order. So you can see that the one that's highlighted floor is the least anxiety provoking, and that's essentially going to be the one that you're going to be working on. Of course, you can work on whichever one you want. You can work on multiple ones at the same time, but it'll always highlight the least anxiety provoking one to kind of give you a starting point. And now, if we want to actually practice that particular exposure, what will happen is it will tell us exactly what we need to do. So we need to practice touching the floor without washing. I'll tell you your anxiety rating. If you tap on practice now, you'll choose an amount of time that you want to practice for, and you're committing during this time not to give in to any compulsive behavior. And then essentially what will happen, you can see the timer. It will start to count down. If you give in and you do a compulsion, you would hit the little gave in button, and it will essentially redirect you to re-expose yourself and kind of do a do-over. If you make it to the end, it will actually ask you to rate your anxiety again. Hopefully it's, you'll see it over time coming down. And all of this information is then stored in a progress report that you email to your therapist, which I really love. So I can see, what, the people that I'm working with are doing on a regular basis or not doing. And now while you're practicing, you can access your toolbox, which has a lot of different nifty tools. Reasons for fighting is exactly that. You can input all the different reasons that you want to fight and beat your OCD. The uncertainty agreement is basically an agreement that you accept that you can never have 100% certainty over anything, and that essentially no matter how many compulsions you do, you'll never have that 100% certainty. So again, that's something that's kind of good to help you resist giving into compulsions. Motivational messages is where you can actually record whatever reminders you want, or if you're working with a therapist and they say something really brilliant, you can record what they say and have that there to remind you, when you're really working on things or when you're having some trouble. There is also a mindfulness meditation, as well as a progressive muscle relaxation. Inspirational quotes, there's a number of those. Spread to get ahead is actually for contamination fears, where you can input all the different places where you're going to spread the contamination after you've exposed yourself. Because we all know if you expose yourself and you touch something and you sit there like this for the next 3 hours and then go wash your hands, you really haven't accomplished anything. What you need to do is really spread that contamination to as many places as possible, and especially like your sacred places, like your pillow and your bed and hairbrush. So it allows you to kind of, put all of those places in as a reminder. Check It Out is for severe checking compulsions, and really only severe checking compulsions. I actually got the idea for this tool from an article that I read about a young girl who started using her phone to take photos of the things that she checked to get out of the house. It was taking her hours to get out of the house. She took a photo of them. She was able to get out. And at first glance, I was like, ugh, that's terrible. You're just replacing, one compulsion with another. But then I really, thought about it, and it's very, very difficult with really severe checking compulsions where they are, taking excessive amounts of time. It's very hard to get someone to go from checking 3 hours to not checking at all. That's really hard. But at the same time, there's no easy way to do it gradually. It doesn't really make sense to say, okay, let's check, only 2 hours instead of 3 hours. And it's kind of like trying to eat one potato chip, it doesn't work so well. You get started and, that's kind of the end of things. So I thought this really provides a very good kind of intermediate step where, and the app will actually, if you go to take a photo, it will remind you like, okay, this is compulsive, are you sure you want to do this? And then if you go in, after the fact to actually view those photos, it'll prompt you again, like, okay, you really don't want to do this. So it really, tries to move you in the right direction of not going back and checking. And hopefully, this is just an intermediate step to, working toward not checking at all and being able to leave the house without viewing the photos, without even taking the photos. And the reward is, obviously it's great for kids, but really good for adults too, to kind of, help keep you motivated. So you can tie a reward to every time you complete an exposure. It'll remind you that, congratulate you, mastered this exposure, and you can take a picture of your reward and plug it in there, and it'll remind you that you've earned your reward. And this also ties into what's called Quick Track, which is essentially, this is really good for kind of very frequent random compulsions that come up where you just want to track how often you're resisting versus giving in. And you can also set a goal for yourself to say, okay, I want to resist giving in 70 or 80% of the time. This is also very good for tics as well. I've had a number of people use it for tics where I want to try to resist for a certain percentage of time, and then you can actually tie a reward to this as well. Okay, so to the settings. So the settings allows you to choose either the adult or the kids version. Practice reminders allows you to set in your calendar. You can actually set alerts to remind you to practice your exposures at specific times during the day, which is really handy and helps, again, you to be as consistent as possible. The OCD severity rating is just a 20-point scale that you rate just to kind of keep track of how you're doing OCD-wise from week to week, and kind of good if you're working with a therapist for them to kind of just get an overall view. And you can set a day and time that you want to be reminded about your reward. These are the different progress reports that it creates. So it will create a progress report. Actually, in the app, you'll be able to view every time you practice and tell you the date that you practice, and it'll tell you your anxiety rating. And it's really cool if you scroll down, and I have somebody using the app for like a period of 4 months, and it was so cool because she would scroll down and you just saw the anxiety ratings going down, 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 down. She had like 1 million of them. She was really good at practicing. But it's really, that's really good to kind of help keep you motivated as well, because you really see the progress that you're making. And when you email this to yourself or your therapist, it actually creates a more comprehensive spreadsheet, which gives even more detailed information about whether you gave in, you were able to resist, how long you practiced for. So it's some good information. And then the OCD severity rating just indicates the number that you indicated for the week. And it will give you percentage of how often you resisted versus giving in for the week. So those are essentially the 3 progress reports. Okay, the other 2 things on the main menu, just to show you guys, the Obsessing Now function. Basically, if you're having an obsession, you're kind of struggling, you don't have your therapist there to tell you what to do, you tap on this, this will essentially give you a little bit of a pep talk, kind of instruct you what to do, and then kind of guide you in going to your exposure hierarchy and trying to do some exposure for it. The just gave in is when you give it into a compulsion and you're like, oh no, what do I do? And so this will essentially, it'll guide you to do a do-over. So re-expose yourself, go back to your exposure hierarchy, and let's try again. Okay, so now this is, if we were to switch gears and use the children's version, this would be your main menu. So you can kind of see how the language is different. If you were to tap on Learn How to Defeat the Worry Wizard, there's actually a whole illustrated audiobook about the Worry Wizard. It's kind of like the backstory of who the Worry Wizard is and how it became the Worry Wizard. It's on my website too. It's kind of cute, so you can watch it. But it kind of sets the stage because what the kids are essentially going to do, they're going to set up their Worry Wizard challenge chart, which is their exposure hierarchy. And every time they master one of their challenges, what happens is Sage the Owl, who's kind of like their little coach, it's kind of Harry Potter-ish, he pops up and there he is! Did you shake your perfect timing, Jenna? That was Sage the Owl! So Jenna can show you. She has used the app, and you use Sage. You call Sage all the time, right? It's pretty cute. So every time they master a challenge, Sage will pop up. Oh no, these are the toolbox. Sage, you can see Sage pops up, and the Worry Wizard pops up. And every time they master a challenge, he loses a part of his costume until, in the end, once they've mastered all of their challenges, his true identity is revealed. So I'm not going to give it away. Play the game and find out. So we go back to the set of the toolbox. They have their secret weapons. A lot of these are very similar. The relaxation is a very kid-friendly version. There's songs for kids, which are absolutely adorable. There's 2 of them in the app, but there's actually an album on iTunes with all songs for kids with OCD. There's a song, Dirt Don't Hurt, which is the cute. They're sung by kids. It's so cute. Go listen to it. You can preview them on iTunes. They're just like the most adorable things. And a friend of mine who actually has OCD herself, she's a social worker and she's a songwriter, actually wrote and didn't record them but had kids record them, so they're very, very sweet. And there's tips from other kids fighting the Worry Wizard, other kids with OCD, and the rest is pretty much the same. And then this is what popped up on Jenna's phone, Help Sage, so if the kids can shake their iPod or shake their phone, and Sage will pop up and kind of give them a little bit of a pep talk and encourage them to do some exposure. And so, and that, oh my gosh, 7:45. That was good. She said, oh, we have 15 minutes for questions. So perfect. So, hopefully I've given you guys some, good information about ERP, kind of, good foundation, maybe, some new stuff for, those of you who are ERP pros out there. And, if you have any questions at all for me regarding the app, anything else, feel free.
What was it here at the beginning where you get the app?
Oh, the app is actually, it's available in the iTunes store.
So all this is available?
It is,
Yeah.
yep. It's launched in iTunes. At the moment, it's only available for Apple mobile, so it'll work on an iPhone, iPod Touch, or an iPad. And an Android version is in the works, hopefully very soon. It will, no, only on mobile devices. Yeah. That's a good question.
Can you refer to a website?
It's liveocdfree.com, and I can't believe I came today without any cards. I have 1,000,001 cards and totally forgot.
Does anybody really do flooding as an exposure?
You know, I'll tell you, I did this search in the Huffington Post, basically anything about OCD, and I'll tell you, it was so demoralizing because there was literally nothing about ERP. Nothing that, I think one article used the term CBT very generally, and it made reference to an article, which when I actually went to the article, they were utilizing ERP. It's exactly what it was. And there was one article that I found that, mentioned anything about ERP, and it was basically this guy saying, yeah, it'll work, really, really well, but you're gonna have to stick your hand in the toilet and eat a Twinkie, And I'm like, oh my God, this is terrible. Nobody's gonna do it. And I think, sometimes we take it for granted, when we're with, a lot of people that have a really good understanding of OCD, that, no, nobody, would do that. That's ridiculous. But in the, public where they don't have this information, I think there are actually a lot of misconceptions, unfortunately, despite, all of our efforts to get the right information out there.
Thank you.
Sure.
Can the app be helpful for boarders?
That's a really good question. There actually is, in my user's guide, there actually is a section on how you can adapt the app to be used for different disorders like body dysmorphic disorder or health anxiety and hoarding. Hoarding is a very, very different disorder. There are tools in here that you can absolutely utilize and kind of, plug into the model. I don't think it's the most ideal, it's definitely, not, it's not meant for hoarding. I think there should be a really good hoarding app out there. This one could be adapted, but, it's a very different disorder. But there is actually a section in there that gives very specific information about how you could utilize it for hoarding.
Can you use it for hoarding? Thank you.
What I can do is I have an iPhone and I have an iPad. What I can do is, maybe set it up in the back and you guys can kind of just come and check it out, play with it. That sounds good. Good? All right. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Why is it an iTunes if it's not all music? That's not an important question, I'm just wondering.
Well, iTunes has both a music store and they have an app store.
Right.
So you're actually going to go to the app store, but if you go to my website, Live OCD Free, you'll actually see at the very top where you click on and it will take you exactly to the right place in the app store.
I try to avoid computer as much as possible.
You're smart.
This culture, you can't really do that.
Yeah. It's a double-edged sword, they're really good in some ways, but.
They don't talk about the bad parts.
Right. All right, well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.